Going.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the triage meeting. Uh, let's start with the action items from previous meetings. So, open action items that don't currently show up as done. We have,
A lot.
we do, yes. Most of them are individual people's reviews and comments on specific items. So, I don't think we need to go over those in detail, just a reminder for them.
Yeah.
Some of these also have been done, and so anybody who has an item that has been done, please go through and mark those off. I will do mine after the meeting so I can keep driving.
Yeah, I did some of these, but
Yeah, I think I've done mine.
I failed a lot, or I have not followed up on a lot of them. I'm trying to say failed less. Go on.
Good call.
I appear
So
twice in the
then,
on the first two action items. I'm assuming it's just a typo. Hopefully that wasn't like an intended
It
to be
looks
a
that way.
edit.
Yeah.
yeah, it looks like a typo rather than
I'm just
double checking.
I'm
The
just
same thing
vaguely
is true
worried
for the
that
third and fourth action item, actually.
Yeah, maybe.
yes. I was worried it might be a cut and paste, like somebody like, the last scribe may have or been trying to, cut and paste and edit and then didn't edit, but oh well, have to accept that these things happen. Okay.
All right. So let's take a quick look at pending proposals. There's only one currently on here, and that's the MCP for allowing the compiler to eagerly drop values. We discussed this previously before, and there was a bunch of asynchronous discussion. Does anybody have any updates on this one?
No. It seemed like our conclusion was we want to convert this into actionable smaller steps in a design note or something.
I think so, yes. Smaller steps as well as that we think the larger item of trying to do it by default is unlikely. So it's purely, could we provide an opt-in mechanism for people who want early drop? Okay,
Right.
would someone like to take a action item to write a brief explanation of that for the MCP, explaining that we would like to see a focused proposal for opt-in early drop?
I think I actually have an action item for that.
Okay.
So at least it says drop guards discussion. I'm going to assume that's what this is.
Probably, yes.
Could be.
Okay, then,
If it's not that, I don't know what it is. So I'm changing it.
all right.
Rewriting history.
Then, Nico, that one's you.
All right.
Then after that, we don't have any nominated RFCs. So let's see. We have only one P-high issue nominated. That's the status on that one for Repr C is unsound on MSVC targets is still waiting on some further discussion. There's still some ongoing efforts to attempt to uh, figure out if this can be fixed compatibly. I suspect in order for this to make substantial progress that we're going to need someone in the community willing to volunteer to push this further and pick up and run with it. So I suspect that what will happen with this one is either someone needs to pick this up and run with it and volunteer to figure out the answer to that question, whether Repr C can be successfully fixed or whether we would need an addition boundary or similar. Or alternatively, we may end up closing this as postponed, not with prejudice, because I think we want to see this issue fixed, but simply because it needs a champion.
Yeah, I don't know if it's close it or downgrade it. But
Fair.
one thought is
I
this is
think in
specific to
practice, it is
MSVC, right?
It is specific to MSVC, and it is also specific to particular types used on MSVC. It is an unfortunate trap for people because there's no obvious warning that lets people know that they're wandering into an area where they have to be careful.
I wonder if we can reach out to some of the Microsoft folks and see if they're interested in.
I think that would be a really good idea. In the ideal world, we would get someone from the Microsoft Rust team to push for full compatibility here and do the necessary evaluation.
I can do
So
that.
it may make,
I can reach out
Okay.
to, you know, people like Wesley and Ryan.
Yeah,
that
just
sounds
see.
great.
Are there still unresolved policy questions from the language perspective in terms of how RepRC interacts with ABI and stability, or is that mostly settled and people are just now talking about how do we square that with what MSVC wants?
So I don't think that there are any further policy questions from a Lang team perspective, in that we've already stated our desire for RepRC to be entirely compatible with the native platform ABI. The open question is just, is the current RepRC sufficiently ingrained in enough programs that the existing behavior is something people rely on, and fixing it would break other things? So I think our two options here would either be try to fix it compatibly if that can be done, or if that can't be done, we may have to introduce a RepRC but actually working, and then migrate that to be RepRC in a new edition. That would be the obvious forward step to make sure that in the future people can just spell it RepRC. But either way, I think we want to fix this. The question is just, can we do it compatibly on all editions, or do we need an edition boundary?
I mean,
So no, I
editions
don't think
aren't
there's any
usually
further policy questions.
Editions don't usually correspond to ABI changes. But maybe you're saying that, like, if we are introduced a RepRC but actually or something, then
That's what I'm
folks who
suggesting, yes,
migrated
that
from
Yeah, I
Okay.
think
yeah, it's the idea would be that there would be an old CABI and a new correct CABI, and in the addition we would change which one RepRC points to.
And it
So
would just
we
be
wouldn't
unfortunate
be
that cargo
changing ABI. Go on.
and it would just be unfortunate that a naive cargo fix of a project to edition 2021 or 2024 or however would turn all RepRCs into RepRC old or something.
Ideally, it could detect whether that's necessary, because we should be able to know whether RepRC will actually affect the ABI, at least in most cases. There are some exceptions if you were potentially using generics, but
Isn't that anything that has a ZST that's being compiled for MSVC? Or is it
I
more
don't believe
specific
it's
than that?
necessarily all ZSTs. I think it also has to do with having an alignment value.
Oh,
So
okay.
the issue is if you have a ZST that has a non byte alignment, for example, an empty array of a type that has alignment 4 or 8, for example, then
Okay.
the size of that would vary.
Thanks.
can
I
we move
believe
on
that's
from
the
this?
case. Yeah, I don't think we need to dig into the weeds here. I think that so Felix, you said you would take an action item to drive this with Wesley, Ryan, or some other folks from
Yeah.
the Microsoft team.
Yeah, I'll reach out to
Perfect.
them.
I think that's the right path
Or at least
forward.
find out if there's interest from Microsoft in, like, you know, having one of their paid engineers spend time on this, right?
Right. Either way, I think practically speaking, this probably doesn't need to be considered P-high or a hard soundness issue, in that things that you would do that would trigger an issue here would be calling some native code or FFI or otherwise doing unsafe code. So this isn't unsound in the sense that you can do safe code that causes unsafe things to happen. It's just a bug, albeit a nasty one. So we may want to prioritize appropriately.
Personally, I feel we can downgrade this from P high to P medium.
Right. I think this is a case study in important but not urgent.
Right. So can we take an
I
action item to downgrade, or go on?
I
say
agree
ahead.
with P medium, but I actually think it should remain ion sound, given that, like, if someone's following sort of what we've documented in the reference as the behavior of RepRC, like, they will get incorrect behavior.
All right, that's fair.
No objection. Well, Taylor, do you want to take the action item then to update that one
Yeah, I'll do that right now.
and write a quick note explaining why?
Some people on the thread suggested a lint might be of interest. I don't know, but if it would fire too much to actually be of use, does anyone recall like or have any intuition there?
Could
It
certainly
may
go on.
go. I was just going to say it should be detectable. I think the cases in which this is an issue would be detectable. The question is it more work to detect them than to fix it?
Mm.
But we would probably want that detection anyway to do a proper Rust fix for an edition. So I think that's probably best discussed with the Microsoft team as well
Yep,
and determine, okay, is there a quick lint we can do before we do a slow fix?
Okay, great.
Okay, we don't have any nominated PRs and issues for Rustlang Reference. So next up, nominated PRs and issues for Rustlang Rust. We have a fair handful of these. There's 5 here. Before we dive into the first one, does anybody have a item that should be prioritized in case we don't get out through all of these? Or should we just go through them in order?
I don't have.
Okay, then let's see if we can get through these. So first up, we have the tracking issue for RFC 2457, allow non-ASCII identifiers. There is a stabilization report provided for this and a proposal to stabilize this. Someone also added a note here in the agenda that we may want to hold off until we have lint levels defined in report. Who added that note and would like to talk about
I
that a
think
little?
Mark did. I don't think he's here.
Okay.
But I'm skimming down the report to see if I can figure out what he's saying.
It looks like third comment from the end of might be good to adjust the stabilization report to include the current lint levels for each of the lints and suggested or required new levels.
Yeah, so the RFC also introduces a suite of lints to protect from confusions.
Right.
All those lints except for non-ASCII indents are currently worn by default and should stay so after stabilization, according to the stabilization report.
That was added, I think, perhaps based on the comment thread. Yeah, that
Okay.
clarification.
As
Then it
such, they
sounds
only
like that point has been addressed.
I'm personally of the opinion we can FCP merge.
I would agree. I think that we should go ahead and FCP merge this, and then if anybody has concerns, they can raise them as blockers.
There is a section called hopefully resolved questions. It says none of them are irreversible. But that might be worth looking at. But I personally don't have a problem with any of the proposed resolutions. I'm not familiar enough with this stuff to have an opinion. But I still think we should FCP merge. I'm just highlighting that as a thing to consider when you read the stabilization report.
Does anybody feel any of those questions need a blocker for people to review, or shall we just give people the FCP time to check their boxes?
I think the latter.
Yeah.
I agree. All right.
So somebody
I will
action
take
item.
the action. I'll take the action item to propose FCP merge here.
You're recording these, right, Felix?
The action items, yeah.
Okay, while you're recording that. Next up, we have implement new lint for detecting buggy pointer to int casts. This is 81789. This is a PR, not just a request. So
Yeah, I
see.
nominated it. There was a comment from Varkor, which I will copy and paste into the notes. PR adds a new lint that triggers when a pointer is cast to a non-usize integer.
Right. To reduce easy to miss bugs like U16 lowercase max as U32, where you would be casting the function pointer named max as opposed to the constant.
And there was some discussion. Oh, I see. Josh, you raised a point on thread that you might prefer
I
to allow
did,
people to
yes.
cast to U64.
Yes. Mark made the comment that he would prefer to still see that as usize as U64. I think my concern there is the potential degree of noise here, because there is a fair bit of code out there that simply uses U64 as this is big enough for a pointer on both 32 and 64-bit platforms. And I don't want to put this on hold for the mythical case of the portability lint of let me opt into assuming I don't have to deal with 128-bit platforms. I think that it would be appropriate to have this lint discriminate carefully and say which types does it avoid complaining about. But I think if we make it not complain about 64-bit, U64 specifically, but complain about any other integer type other than usize, then I think that this would be, I'd be perfectly fine with making this one by default. I'd be happy to discuss the other one further as well. I just think that I would find that one to be a little bit more concerning.
I don't find the 128-bit portability argument very persuasive.
Right.
Because it feels like the kind of thing there. I'm trying to put my feeling into words, but there's a kind of thing where also in C, I think you have this, where there's like extreme portability. I mean, you definitely have this in C. Extreme portability rules that nobody can actually follow in practice, and the end result is people just ignore sort of
right.
less portable than they would be if you had some sensible rules that target most platforms. It might
You're
be
also much
interesting.
more likely to introduce bugs on platforms that exist while trying to deal with something you can't test because few, if any, people have access to hardware they can test it on.
Yeah. So one thing I might be interesting. I guess I would be happy with as U64 being allowed. It might be interesting to talk about what, if we did care about this in the future, what would we do? I guess it just comes down to we would start linting, and you could even imagine an addition change.
Right. If we ever introduce the portability lint where you have to explicitly opt into I'm only ever going to run on 64-bit platforms or 64 and 32-bit platforms or similar, then I would have no objection to making this lint a warn by default and then separately triggering everything off the portability lint. But in this case, there is an obvious way to solve the problem that does not block on that. So would there be any objections from folks in this meeting to a consensus of if you change this to not warn on U64, then we would FCP this?
I wouldn't object.
Taylor, Felix?
No, no objection.
No objection, but not going to write it.
I think we are.
That's
I just want to say explicitly that I think we're making a kind of precedent here, which I'm happy with. Though I think we should enumerate it a little more clearly, that we want lints to target sort of encouraging practical portability with their default settings. Is that correct?
That sounds like an accurate precedent.
I was going to say, I feel like what's happening here is that we're applying our sort of general policy on false positives for lints, but
I agree that it's an instance of it could be seen that way as well.
For completeness, one other question. We have occasionally done crater runs on lints that we feel may, despite our policy that we can introduce new lints without it being considered breakage, we sometimes run crater on lints that we think will be extremely noisy. Do we think that this in particular is likely to be extremely noisy and might merit a crater run, or do we think that this is sufficiently valuable that we should go ahead and do it even if there were a lot of noise?
I don't think it's that likely. I don't know.
I suspect the only likely case would be some code that was designed exclusively for one platform, and that platform is 32-bit, and therefore it's casting to U32. That seems like the only likely case where someone would be doing large quantities of this correctly.
Maybe in some embedded scenarios, yeah.
Right.
But I think it's okay for them to add and allow.
Right, either add an allow or add a lot of as usize as U32. For that matter, usize for them should be 32.
Okay, I have to drop for 1 second. Be back.
All right, I'll take over
All
for
right.
notes.
I'd be happy to take the. Actually, on second thought, I would like it if someone else would take the action item for this one, just because I was the person to originally propose the U64 exception here, and I would appreciate somebody else chiming in to confirm the Lang team consensus, as opposed to me reporting that it happens to agree entirely with what I would propose. So
Sure, I'll leave a comment.
much appreciated. Thank you. All right, then next up we have make unaligned references future incompat lint worn by default. That's 82525. This was reported by or proposed by Ralph 26 days ago. The original blocker for this, I believe, was that the adder of mechanism that we had introduced for obtaining raw addresses had not yet been stable, so we didn't have anything for people to replace it with. This PR now makes this a warn by default future incompatibility lint. And people can always switch over to using standard pointer adder of. Are there any objections to changing the default of this?
What did we talk about this last week? Didn't we talk about this last week? I'm trying to remember. All I remember is I argued about it and then I realized I was wrong.
We did talk about this. I'm back. I
just wanted to know what was open about it, I guess.
I think it might be that we just didn't do the follow-up we needed to do. I'm just checking the minutes real fast. And by we, I probably mean me.
Was there an action item here for you?
82525.
Yeah.
That's right.
I guess oh yeah, I see Nico to adder of and review PR. So yeah, I'll leave a comment, but the short version was we want to do this and we just need to review the PR.
All right, I have to drop off. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks.
Taylor.
I remember this now because Josh actually pinged on Zulip.
So for this one, then you're going to review the functional correctness of the PR, and then we agree on the policy. And so as soon as the correctness is verified, then we're going to FCP merge this.
Correct.
Sounds good. So action item on you to review and then FCP merge when ready.
Correct.
Ping me if you run out of time on doing the review, Nico. I know you got a lot of stuff on your plate. I mean, we both do, but
Yeah, okay. I'll do that. I think it's a fairly simple PR though.
I'm glad to see we've made progress on this one. Next up, we just have 2 left in half an hour. Let's see if we can get through both of them. We have
God hope so.
turn old edition lint anonymous parameters into worn by default on 2015. This is 82918.
Yeah, so there's a bit of a policy question here. I can give a quick update.
Okay.
I
I see. On 2015.
So what this is about is, right, the lint case is this code that we used to accept. And we removed in some RFC or other, or we started warning or something like that. And I think the plan is for edition 2021 to make this a hard error. But the question was essentially, are we going to warn about this in older editions? And one of the things we talked about in the lint meeting we had was a kind of policy around, we don't necessarily warn on things just because a future edition is going to make them a hard error, but more if we want them to be deprecated in general. And the argument in favor of deprecating this in general is that a lot of tooling, including the SYN crate, doesn't accept this notation, as well as IDEs. So while the compiler will accept it, your code is generally less compatible with the ecosystem if you do use it. So I actually think that's a pretty strong case for deprecating it, and we should go ahead and make it a warning on all editions. But that's the policy question at hand, and there's a kind of a precedent around, like, it's not a soundness or other reason exactly. It's like it's annoying for tooling to support this reason. You could imagine this coming to play with impls and things that are not easy for IDEs to deal with, as we've discussed from time to time, like nested items.
Right. So I know that I'm the person who has objected most strongly to things similar to this in the past. In this particular case, I would actually be fine with this one modulo a couple of specific things. I would propose that we talk about this one for a few minutes and see if we do have a consensus. And if we don't, then I know that the standard Arch team has been waiting on 83.167 for a while. And if we show signs that we might spend the rest of the meeting talking about a policy for editions and edition lengths, then I'd like to take 10 minutes and see if we can go solve the other one first. But let's see if we have consensus on this first.
Go for it.
I have a,
So
do we have a,
go ahead,
is this
Felix.
going to have its own like umbrella lint? Like, because it seems like this is like general category things that might, or should we wait until we actually have other examples of other things that break third-party tools that might want an umbrella category to name them?
I haven't thought about that.
I
It's a
think
good
it's
question.
more than just. I think it's more than just tools don't accept it. If I remember correctly, I remember us doing a change to catch this in the first place, where our argument was this was kind of accepted by accident, and we just had to keep accepting it because people used it, but it wasn't actually intended to be valid syntax.
That's another argument. That's a different argument.
That's a retcon also. I
Okay.
definitely remember us accepting this on purpose. Maybe I said
Okay.
otherwise in the past, but if so, I
Good
was
to know.
misremembering.
I think I remember there being a discussion about it. I don't know if it was amongst the Lang team, but I definitely remember talking about this with people like Patrick, I think.
I mean, this syntax goes way back to like when Orion first implemented traits.
Okay.
Well, it
good to
doesn't
have the
matter.
historical record there.
Yeah, I don't think it really makes much difference.
So a related question, is this something that is, do we have a conception of how widely used this is in existing code, and especially in existing code that is still in use rather than historical?
I have no idea.
I guess I'm asking, if we were to make this a warn by default, would we expect to see 0 warnings, 3 warnings, or 300,000 warnings, depending on if there's some root crate that we're not aware of that breaks horribly if you do this?
So are we talking about a creator run on this PR?
Possibly. I was initially asking, does anybody happen to know?
I believe
If
the
this is
RFC
used.
had some data, but it's dated now. I actually thought this was worn by default. Oh, you know what? It's a
Okay.
hard error in the 2018 edition already.
Oh,
So
really?
Oh,
Okay. So that's much more compelling. If this were just going to hard error in 2021, that's different. If this has been a hard error for a few years, then it's safe to say that any code that people are using that has this in it has probably not been maintained in a while.
yeah, I think it's pretty safe.
Okay, that addresses all of my concerns then, and I would have no problem with going ahead with this.
All right, let's do it. I think
I
from a
don't
policy
think
point
that
of
this,
view, like I'm happy with it because I want us to push for more consistency across editions. So like in general, I think we should, this feels like a deprecation to me. Like we took this syntax away because we thought it was bad. The reason it was bad is it made parsing more complicated for tooling, but like, that's fine. We want people not to use it. We should deprecate it. This is in contrast to like the closure, changing the rules on closure capture. It doesn't make sense to me to warn about, if you upgrade to the new edition, your closure is going to change meaning. There's nothing wrong with your old closure.
right. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily want to make this a precedent for we always push warnings back to the earliest edition we can. But in this case, I think it's relatively safe to do so, and it's unlikely to affect a significant number of people, but it will help people catch things in existing code. Also, in practice, people are unlikely to build new code with the 2015 edition, which means they're probably not going to see this lint to begin with.
Yep. All right, so let's talk about this 83.167.
wait,
Yep.
action item for this then at this point is someone going to own SFT
Oh,
merging this?
ha 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 ha. You're right.
I'll take it.
Yeah, okay. Now that you mention that action, the 83.167, I also had, let me check. I think I had some things from the Lang team meeting agenda I wanted to bring up from the edition, but this was one of them, and the other was the K-hash foo proposal, which unfortunately Scott's not here. I'm going to put it here. Let's talk about this, but then we can talk about.
Yeah, I would love to talk about that one in a meeting. So a bit of background here, and feel free to interrupt if people already know this, but Standard Arch has a bunch of architecture-specific intrinsics for various SIMD mechanisms. Some of those, specifically the shuffle intrinsics, most commonly, require compile time constants. They are directly encoded in instructions and can't be obtained from registers or anything else that comes from runtime. This was previously implemented by accepting a parameter and then having a rustc only attribute that says this must really be a constant, treat it as a compile time constant, and error out if it depends on runtime. And there's apparently some fairly painful code in the compiler to implement that mechanism. So the proposal is to change those intrinsics to instead accept a const generic, and that allows them to require a constant argument without a special case. So
I'll give an example.
Yeah, the question is, do we want to force all of the callers to use the const generic syntax in a new edition rather than allowing them to use the older syntax and shuffling the arguments around for them? We are going to still need the argument rewriting code to stick around for 2015, 2018 code, because this is a stable intrinsic. So unfortunately, we do have to keep this support in the compiler. But we could require all new code be written using the const generics mechanism. The trade-off here is, go on, Felix.
Well, I was going to point out that, I mean, because when you first introduced this, it sounded like you were saying this is to benefit, like simplifying the compiler, and which the, what you just said, you would think would immediately contradict, say, well, then there's no point because we still have to keep the code around. But it's not just that. The description says that there's significant overhead. It's generating huge mirror. Like it's a complexity burden in the actual evaluation of the code, not just the complexity of like maintaining the compiler itself, right? Does that make sense?
Sorry, no. The previous mechanism was using the large switch and the mirror to sort that out.
Right.
And then the everything has been switched over to using const generics, and then there is a mechanism to translate one to the other.
Oh,
So
okay.
if I'm understanding correctly, and I may be mistaken here, I believe that the internal mechanism is now using const generics, and there is just a facade on top of that that allows you to use syntax that calls it with an argument as opposed to a generic parameter. If you look at the special rustc attribute here, on that first example, it was rustc argument args required const, which is make sure this is a constant, and then we'll go through this big switch. Later, it's rustc legacy const generics 2, which is saying take that and make it a new argument at that position for compatibility.
Okay. So we're not supporting the old things via the same implementation strategy. We have a different implementation strategy for them that utilizes the new functionality. Okay.
Yeah,
Exactly.
the functions are always written with const generics. We just rewrite the AST, if I recall correctly, during lowering.
So thank you for that clarification. Okay.
Right. Beyond that, I think the expectation here is that the reason I mentioned this code being fairly terrible in the compiler, according to the folks who've worked on it, is not because we were able to rip that code out, but rather if we can compartmentalize that code as a legacy support mechanism that will never be used for anything else. And then we also don't have to worry about, is it compatible with future things? Because it would be just as easy to say, well, if you want to use other future mechanisms, you have to migrate away from this, so we don't have to support them simultaneously or deal with the interactions between them. Deprecating it allows us to contain the complexity.
So there's another side. The argument against deprecation is that some intrinsics, first of all, the syntax that you use to invoke the intrinsic is now sort of different in Rust from what you will find in the Intel architecture manual.
Right.
And separately, in some cases, the constant is in the middle of the list. So it's not just like take the thing from the end, but it might be like in this case, the 1 + 1 moves from the middle into this list, which is indicated by this positional argument 1. One thing I thought when I heard this is that this feels like a little bit of a feature request, potentially. I don't know if it'd be a good one though, where it would be like, it seems indisputable to me that this is more ergonomic, is basically what I'm getting at, and makes me wonder if you would want something like, I don't know exactly how you would notate it,
Putting const parameters in the argument list.
But I don't intend to block anything or even try to turn this into a real proposal. I'm just noting that it might be kind of cool.
So one other possible solution here is that it would not be hard to introduce a macro that accepts all of the arguments in order and then translates one of them into a const generic argument. So if people wanted the argument order to precisely match, then we could introduce a macro.
That's a good point. So the other
This
thing,
is actually what some third-party mechanisms for this do, is use a macro for this rather than doing const code at compile time.
you mean third-party Rust crates, or what do you mean by third-party?
Third-party Rust crates that are doing attempts at portable SIMD, yes. When
So-
things like that were brought in first party into standard Arch, then we switched over to this mechanism. But third-party stuff has been using macros for these types of shuffles for some time.
The other thing I would say is that Mouse or Mara pointed out a possible compromise from the libs team meeting of newer edition only supporting the Rust syntax, but we can totally have a machine applicable lint that does the translation. And so the cost to moving is quite small. I have a question. Did the SIMD, there's like a SIMD working group in theory, right? Now, I'm not sure how active that is. Did they have an
Quite
opinion on this?
active, and I believe this proposal is coming out of that group, or at
Okay.
least involves members of that group.
I guess
Anyway.
I don't know. I would personally say that I really don't want to ask people to write the const generic syntax that's like moving the argument out of the normal list. It feels like I don't know. I'm not sold that it's actually that bad to just accept the rewrite in the compiler.
Wait, now I don't understand. Wait, I thought you were saying like you don't, sorry, like line 8 in the code. I thought you were saying like looking at line 8 in the code up above, it doesn't look that great. I wouldn't want to write that. But then you said you'd be willing to accept the rewrite in the compiler. So now you're saying you'd accept if the compiler
I'm
rewriting
saying
links
that
in line
I
8.
would rather the compiler take care of, you know, changing the order of the arguments for me in a way that makes stuff happen, rather than forcing end users to sort of look at.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, right. Not Rust fix rewriting. Right. You're talking about
Right.
compiler rewriting. Okay, yes.
So what you can say now is that this form, the advantage of the const generics form, like we definitely want it available both for the architectural advantages, but also because, well, I guess this isn't true. I was going to say also because in generic code, it's usable, but actually with the rewrite, probably that works equally well, whether it's in generic code or.
Yeah, I don't think there's a difference.
Yeah. Okay.
You're so right about that feature request though, Nico. Like this is a place where turbofish is yeah, not necessary in principle.
It doesn't
Frankly, I
really
think
seem
the
to me that there's a
turbofish
much
is less the
advantage.
problem as the order issue.
There's not much of an advantage to doing this, right? It's just sort of that the language feels a bit smaller. We don't, but it's not really smaller. It's just like it's still part of the spec at the end of the day that Rust legacy const generics is a thing. Like you have to have a mechanism for this.
Yeah, I think I would also say that potentially it's worth noting that even if we could remove it, like it's not obvious to me that, you know, if we were redesigning this from scratch, like part of our goal with the SIMD intrinsics was explicitly matching what the like Intel compiler does. We didn't rewrite, you know, their
Right.
names or anything else. And so saying, well, you know, we'll allow the like name lints and so forth for these, but
Right.
change the parameter order for you and force you to use const generics feels kind of, I don't know, ungreat.
So here's
Yeah.
an alternative. Suppose we did introduce a macro here with exactly the same name as the function, and you just have to add an exclamation mark and your code continues to compile. And it has the arguments in the correct order, and then it calls the underlying const generic rather than relying on the legacy const generics mechanism. Would would you, Mark, or would anybody object to that being the proposed rewrite so that you don't have to reorder your arguments? You just have to turn it into a macro, because this kind of feels like macro style rewriting anyway.
What does that bias?
You don't have something that rewrites syntax that isn't a macro.
I don't know. I guess I would rather not introduce like 200 plus macros or whatever it would be for the simple reason of change. Like it's not actually rewriting the syntax really. It's just a different place of putting, like it's not changing the expression. It's not introducing any different token form or anything. Like it doesn't feel, I don't know. The macro feels like extra noise and not, if we were going back and redesigning them maybe, but I would rather just not touch people's code.
I guess the reason I can see sort of for what Josh is saying here is if I were trying to analyze my source code and predict what my machine code is going to be like, I might be, and I'm not realizing that this is an intrinsic that's handled specially by the compiler, then at least with a macro, I wouldn't expect to see, you know, these things evaluated and emitted into the argument positions, etc. before the
If I'm
call.
remembering some of, yeah, if I'm remembering some of the discussions on Zulip correctly, I believe this also wreaks havoc with code analysis or code movement tools or similar, which have no idea that this argument cannot be a runtime value. That would be a difficult thing to teach a IDE to handle.
Yeah, I don't know. I
wouldn't want to go to a macro if there were any chance that we might do the thing that Nico was sort of sketching out though, right? Like if we actually were gonna hypothetically try to support const parameters mixed in with the normal argument list, then I'd rather keep supporting the syntax that's in there already and, you know, try to support it in a full manner, and just expect third-party tools to also do the same.
That's fair. If we wanted to make this a full feature, I agree.
I don't know how realistic it is.
If we're
Yeah.
wanting to use this, I think we would want it to be on the track towards that, as opposed to something that only the compiler will ever use in only these specific cases.
Would we?
For what it's worth, the standard Arch team has already committed to the plan that any future architectures will use the const generics and won't provide the legacy mechanism. This is just for x86 generics.
Well, why did they make that call? I have two
Because
questions.
Nothing else was stable, so there was no compatibility requirement. The impression I have is that if this wasn't stable, they would not have bothered to ask.
Yeah, I'm not. So I have a few thoughts. First is that I'm somewhat inclined to weigh, like I do like that. This feels like a bit of a judgment call, and I want to hear from the users more than anyone else. I'm not sure whether I think the standard Arch team is representative of them, but that's kind of what they're existing for. But there is, because it feels like Mark's argument, not to put Mark on the spot, but the argument, the other side is like, this is annoying for people who are using this, and I kind of want to know what people who are using it will feel and think. I could see either way. I think I'd be a little annoyed, but the other thing is that I would feel like we don't have to have committed to creating a, we don't have to know whether we want to do the thing I proposed above in order to say we're gonna, like, we have to accept this anyway. So saying we're gonna hold off on deprecating it for some time until we, you know, have a better plan of whether we want to turn this into a real feature or not feels totally legit to me. It's not like we're doing extra work to do it.
Yeah, I think I would also say that it's not like clear to me, at least from what you said, Josh, whether the SUDARC team in making sort of the call or saying that, you know, maybe future architecture shouldn't use this old sort of legacy syntax. It feels to me, and I think from what I recall from those discussions, it was mostly well, we don't want to increase our burden, but it doesn't feel like it really makes any difference. You know, if we had one intrinsic, then maybe I would say, yeah, we shouldn't add, you know, 200 more. But I think right now we have at least a couple dozen of these legacy ones. And so it's not like we're really changing the situation much, whether we add more or not, in my opinion. So like, if it is genuinely true that people want to use the new syntax, I wouldn't stop them, or use the like legacy syntax. Like I wouldn't. The stability argument, I don't think is a good one for saying to not use it.
Hmm. I mean, can we crystallize there's like a pro and a con list, but I don't find it expressed in the way I want it to. Like, I think there's two things at conflict here. And it's basically like two kind of tenets, so to speak. My assumption is one of them is that we want const generics to match the Intel specification as closely. Sorry, not const generics. We want SIMD intrinsics to match the Intel specification, or the usage of SIMD intrinsics as closely as we can, right? And the other is we want a kind of language free of, we want a language with fewer mechanisms or something.
With a smaller surface area and weirdness expenditure, effectively.
Right.
We have like the argument in favor of either using const generics or a macro is that both of those things are established mechanisms that can require you to do things like you must pass a constant here, or you must pass the specific kind of syntax here. This mechanism is a new piece of surface area that says you must pass a constant here.
Right. But we do have to support that in older code.
We do.
But whether that matters, I don't know. It's really a matter of like, what are we, in other words, it's not about implementation complexity or anything else. It's about, or spec complexity. It's about, if I'm a user who has the privilege of writing 2021 code, I don't have to know about this.
So what would be the best way for us to reach people who we believe would have valuable opinions on this? We know a few people who widely use this kind of syntax. We could potentially do large-scale greps to find people using this syntax and ask them. I don't think it's that widely coded to.
That sounds actually pretty okay to me. Like I feel like the people who we are really talking about here are people who will be writing Rust 2021 plus code, which is kind of everybody, who will be using these intrinsics, right? Like if we have this feature and nobody uses it, then you also don't care that it exists, right? You only care if you're actually using these things.
Well, for that matter, it occurs to me that there's one specific thing that I would find to be an extremely compelling argument. We're keeping this in older editions, and it's not uncommon for SIMD to be wrapped up in a crate such that you have a nice safe surface syntax on top of it.
I gotta go be with that.
Okay. If it turns out that this is sufficiently annoying to people who would write code like this, that they would be willing to just make their SIMD crates permanently use Rust 2018 so that they can use this syntax and then not have to care what we think, then that is a really strong argument that we should preserve this syntax on an ongoing basis to avoid locking people on older editions. The only reason to make this change is if we believe people will actually adopt this syntax.
Well, I would also say, and we believe that they won't right? Like you can always use the const generics form with, I assume, any of these functions if you want to. So really, what we're saying is, people will care so much that they want the compiler to tell them to use the const generics form, and I find that really hard to believe. And we can always add a lint later. So like, I'm not convinced that we need to make a decision today in some sense. And if people care that much, I can't imagine they, don't use it because the compiler doesn't tell them to.
So it sounds like we're settling on a conclusion of we're hesitant to force people in this direction without direct user feedback from people who are likely users or existing users of this mechanism, saying that they are either neutral or actively in favor of const generics.
I would say
that sound
actively in
like-
favor. Yeah. And I would also potentially add that I at least feel that we should not create new intrinsics or stabilize new intrinsics that don't use this mechanism.
Can you state that again to make it unambiguous?
So if we are adding or stabilizing new intrinsics that currently are either, well, regardless of how they're written, I would like us to continue having a uniform access to intrinsics that need a const argument so that you don't have to write, some intrinsics with potentially either syntax and some intrinsics only with const generics.
So to clarify, you're saying if we add new intrinsics on x86 as opposed to if we add new intrinsics for another platform, or do you mean both?
I mean all platforms.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Mark, can you just clarify again what you mean by that statement? I'm trying to understand. You're saying you want to make sure that we continue having the non-const generic interface, or not? You're not saying that because Standard Arch says they're not going to continue providing that interface, right?
Right. What I'm saying is I think that we should, at least my opinion is that Standard Arch should provide the new interface, the old interface, and whatever, I don't know how we want to call it, but like
Okay.
the either one works interface. And
So-
if they have an argument against that, then I want to hear it. And that argument I don't think can be, we just want to avoid digging ourselves a larger pit.
So I would be inclined at the moment towards the argument of let's not dig ourselves deeper until we have information. We can always add new ways to call the same functions. We can't take them away. So given that, I would be inclined, I'd be willing to support the conclusion of we want more user data on what people will feel like they want to call to
No,
decide whether we want to keep this mechanism.
There is a mistake in that reasoning though, because if a new API is added and there's only one way to access it, people are gonna be forced to use it even if they prefer not to. I mean, the style of data you get is actually people saying whether they like it or not, that's okay. But if the style of data is like do a survey of like how much we see one form use the other, then we're getting artificial bias by only adding one access point, right?
This is fair, but to my knowledge, I don't believe there are currently any new intrinsics that have been added that exclusively use the const generic syntax.
Right. It's just that's the plan going forward for Standard Arch is the thing there. So
I mean, I'm happy to discuss again. I don't feel like we're digging ourselves deeper by adding, like, I feel like we make the situation actively worse by telling people you have to use the only the const generics form for some intrinsics. And then, like, I feel like that just makes things worse. And I don't think it actually buys us anything.
I can understand that argument. Well, at a minimum, I think we're all in agreement that we do want more information from users before making a decision on this. So I would
I actually, to some extent, don't, but I won't be opposed. Like I feel like my argument is not based on what users think in some sense.
Well, that would depend. If we had a handful of, if we have users who are actively saying, I would prefer the const generic syntax, I suspect that would change your opinion. If we have users saying, I don't care, then it sounds like that wouldn't change your opinion.
I think if a user comes to us and says they actively dislike the non-const generics form, then that changes my opinion. But if they say they prefer the const generics form but have no opposition to the non-const generics form, then it doesn't actually matter because maybe
you're worried about the silent majority, I take it, Mark, right? Or even the silent group that doesn't realize there's even a debate here, right?
Sure, or just the people who maybe, like whether they're silent or not, I don't know. I guess it feels weird that like I'm okay with an opt-in lint, like Clippy could lint against it or something, but
So I realize somebody else is affected by this besides folks using the intrinsics. Josh cited them earlier. I'm back, by the way, obviously, just got back. And then I have to drop off, but which is tool makers. Because the only other person who cares about the full range of what kind of code can be used are tool makers, right?
Right.
And I don't know how strongly I consider this code reordering thing but it's definitely like one more gotcha to be aware of. You would have
Right.
to have done some naming. It's probably fairly easy to add some heuristics to be like, oh dear God, this thing is like __MM something. I won't touch it, but still.
Or alternatively, here's the hard-coded list of things for which I should treat them as though they're macros. But yes, it would be good to get feedback there as well. If we have people from Rust Analyzer or from the other IDEs and tools that, yeah, this is no problem, we'll deal with it with only mild grumbling, then that's useful information as well.
We're at the hour, we're past the hour. What should we do here?
Yeah,
What is our
we should-
action item?
So I'd be happy to take the action item of state that we would like to get more information from these two groups. And then I think beyond that, people are welcome to chime in with what they would like to see. Mark, I think that you may want to summarize your position as a comment.
How would you like to get that? I think that's a great action item. Let's discuss on Zulip how to actually get it. But
Right.
I kind of want to just
Yeah.
think about it also. This was helpful
I'm
for me
happy
to
to leave
write
a
out
comment.
the crystal debate.
Okay.
So
Then I will summarize the request for information, and Mark, you can leave a comment for your position on keyboards.
Sounds good.
Okay. Then let's go ahead and wrap up the meeting. And while we pushed the time boundary a little bit, we did get to all of those items. Sorry, Nico, that we did not get to K-Fu, though.
I'll put it on Zulip.
Sounds good. Do you want to go ahead and end the recording, Nico?
In the meeting too. Thanks, everyone.